Hello my friends, HM here. In this video we are going to discuss kill ratios for the Ukraine war. So what is a kill ratio? I have one up here. It shows a Ukrainian kill ratio for tanks that is 3.7. And what does that mean? It means Ukraine are destroying 3.7 Russian tanks for every tank that Russia destroys from Ukraine. Why would you care about kill ratios? Well, you'd care about it because it's the only way to win a war, that is to get your kill ratio up, that you destroy a lot more of the enemy's equipment and soldiers than they can destroy of your equipment and soldiers. That's how wars are won, and that's why everybody who has an interest in the Ukraine war carefully study these kill ratios. And that's why you should watch my video if you also think this sounds interesting. I will only discuss kill ratios in this video for total equipment and also total personal losses. The specific kill ratios for tanks and airplanes and so forth I will discuss in some forthcoming videos. I'll also show you the daily kills that Ukrainians are making, and I'll discuss development over time and what causes the development in these kill ratios and daily kills. But let's get to it. So first I'm going to show you this table here and explain how that's structured. That's where all my data is. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the sources before we proceed with the rest of the presentation. So what do we see here? In this table, I've gathered kill ratios that are calculated for all of the war since it began in February 24, 2022. And as you can see here, we have all the types of losses that you can imagine: tanks, armored fighting vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, all kind of things, aircraft, raiders, helicopters, you name it. And then down here, we total it all up. With total equipment losses. I haven't included 26 and 29, and 26 here is unmanned aerial vehicles. The reason I don't include that is that they're not that reliable. It's difficult to define exactly what we mean with an unmanned aerial vehicle. It's flying things in the air, but there are so many different kinds of flying things, so I don't want that number to affect the total equipment losses. And also I don't include 29, that would be trucks, vehicles, and jeeps. Now that's clearly defined, but they cost almost nothing, and Russia's definitely not running out of that kind of equipment, so no reason to include it here. Plus they're so numerous, so ridiculous to compare one truck with a naval ship. We want to have total equipment losses about the stuff that matters. That would be tanks, artillery, ships, and airplanes and stuff, anti-aircraft systems. Anyway, this table here is structured with all the information you need to figure out who's winning in the Ukraine war. Here we have losses from February 24, 2022 to April 11th of 2024. And we have Russian losses confirmed in this column down here, and then we have Ukrainian losses confirmed in this column down here. And I'm dividing this column here with this column in order to get the kill ratios that are confirmed. That would be the Ukrainian kill ratios. And as I said in the introduction, we had this kill ratio of 3.7 for tanks. That's the one you see right here. What else can we see in this table here? Well, there are also some Russian losses unconfirmed. They are much higher, and that's because there's no video evidence of unconfirmed losses, but I do have that for confirmed losses. But I'll get back to that in a moment when I discuss the sources. So it's higher when it's unconfirmed. And what else do we see here? We see there are Russian average losses unconfirmed per day. That's simply this number here, tank losses of unconfirmed 7,000 divided by the number of days that this war has lasted. That's 777 days currently. Divide that with this and you get 9.2 daily losses. Also a very important number, tank kills here. And also, what else do I have? I have likely Russian new production of tanks here and all the other kinds of equipment where I found that number from. And here you can see it's less than one tank per day they can produce. And then finally over here I have remaining Russian active and passive stocks on April 11th, 2024. So the newest stock that I can measure. Now there were some pre-war stocks that I had found information for, and I've taken that number and then I have adjusted that number with number of unconfirmed kills that I have subtracted with these pre-war stocks and added that extra production that they have had during the war in order to arrive at this remaining Russian active and passive stocks. Here we have almost 7,000 tanks, meaning Russia has 7,000 tanks either in active service or in long-term storage that they can draw from. So that's basically all the data there is in this table, and now you get that. Now let's talk a little bit about the sources. I have it here. All the sources I have for all these data can be found in an Excel spreadsheet that I've made, and that you can follow the link below this video, and then you can download that spreadsheet yourself so you can get those tables where I made these calculations. It's a much bigger spreadsheet than this small table here because it contains all my data, whereas this one is condensed data that just have what is suitable for a PowerPoint presentation. But you can download that Excel spreadsheet. I'll just briefly show you how it looks. Let me draw it in here. Okay, so here it is, this table. So as I said, this table is much bigger. Here you can see some of the tables I have created that I just showed you, but I'll just show you where the sources are there right here, from losses from February to April 11th, 2024. Here we can see the numbers. So for instance, Russian losses confirmed Then I go down this table, and here we have all the sources. They're just down in a similar table below if you want to check it out. Let's click one of them. Here, that is Russia sources confirmed, and here it is from this ORYX organization. It's an organization that is made up of volunteers that are combing the internet for information about Russian losses, all kind of video and picture footage. It has to be confirmed with some sort of evidence. And then they list for every single kill there is, they list this evidence with a link to it. Let's click on anything here. That would be a tank loss here. That would be a captured tank. That is this one. Okay, there's video evidence of that. So that was from Twitter. I'm just shutting that down. You can see there's a lot of evidence, and it's for every single kill that they make on these pages. And there's a similar page for Ukraine losses where there's pictures of that for Ukraine. There's also this Russian losses unconfirmed. Where do I get that from? Let's click that. I get this from Euromaidan Press, and they are making daily updates to Russia's losses, and they take their data from the Ukraine Armed Services that are making these data. Of course, the Ukraine Armed Services has inside information from their military about how much they destroy of Russian equipment. Now, Russia is also making these daily kills of Ukraine equipment that they are destroying, but it's complete propaganda and cannot be trusted. You sum it up, they are destroying much more Ukrainian equipment than Ukraine ever got. So, of course, it's nonsense. Whereas destruction of Russian equipment that is reported by the Ukraine army looks a lot more sensible if you compare the numbers. So I kind of trust them. They're probably a little bit optimistic from the point of view of Ukraine, but I do believe that they are worth studying. And they also report the percentage of destroyed equipment from total stocks that Russia had pre-war. That's how I'm calculating the other. Let me shut this browser down, get rid of this table here all together. These remaining Russian active and passive stocks that I talked about, that's how I calculate them, because I have the pre-stocks also from Euromaidan Press. What else can I say? Well, likely Russian new production daily. I have that from various sources. Again, you can find them in my Excel spreadsheet that you can download. But there are some of these sources I cannot find, and then I explain some assumptions I have made in order to make an estimate of what they likely are to the best of my knowledge and whatever I know about this. So now that we have discussed the data and how they are organized in this table here, and also the sources they came from, let's discuss the data itself. And the main result is that total equipment losses here, we can calculate a kill rate for that, the overall kill rate for equipment losses, and that is 2.7, as we can see down here. So Ukraine on average destroy 2.7 times more equipment from Russia than Russia is able to destroy of equipment from Ukraine. That's a pretty remarkable result, because the circumstances is that Ukraine has a much smaller army than Russia has, and they also have weapons that are not as modern as Russia has in many cases. There are a few cases where Ukraine actually has better weapons than Russia, but not many. Let me tell you, the main thing that Ukraine is lacking is probably a capable air force that can compete with Russian aircraft and helicopters. Ukraine likely got, I haven't gotten the data, but from everything I know about Ukraine, they likely got less than 10% of the aircraft and helicopters that Russia has. So Russia has, as we can see in this table, 1,200 aircraft and 800 helicopters. Ukraine likely has less than 120 aircraft and 80 helicopters. And also the problem with Ukraine's aircraft and helicopters is that it's like 40 years old, 30 years old stuff from the Soviet era, and Russia has far more modern aircraft and helicopters than Ukraine has. And despite of that, Ukraine still destroy a lot more equipment than Russia does. Another weapon that Russia has plenty of, as the Ukraine doesn't have plenty of, is ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and also long-range drones. Russia can attack every day Ukraine with, I'd say right now it's about 60 of these weapons every day. These are heavy weapons that can attack all over Ukraine, and Ukraine don't have the air defenses to shoot all of these missiles and drones down. So that's another weapon where Russia has simply better military equipment than Ukraine has. So then how can it be that Ukraine is killing more Russian equipment than the other way around? Well, one thing is that Russia is the attacking force and Ukraine is the defending force. It's always an advantage to be defending rather than attacking, because you can sit in fortified positions and basically wait for the Russians to pop up, and then you can start shooting at them when they attack. And also you can have minefields, lots of minefields that will blow the Russians up when they attack. Also, Ukraine has managed to train, I think, their soldiers better than Russia has. We have heard horrible stories about Russia sending their foot soldiers out after only a few weeks of basic training, whereas Ukraine have a better training program. But Russia has changed over time, and we'll come back to that when we compare the kill ratios, how they developed over time, and Russia is adapting here. Anyway, there are also a few cases I should mention where Ukraine has has better weapons than Russia. For instance, anti-tank missiles. Ukraine got American and European anti-tank missiles that are of a higher quality and are better at killing Russian tanks and infantry vehicles than the similar weapons that Russia has. And then you could also say that Ukraine gets intelligence from American spy satellites and European radar airplanes that are flying in Europe, looking deep into Ukrainian and Russian airspace and giving them intelligence about where the Russian targets are so Ukraine can target them. That's an advantage for Ukraine. But all in all, Ukraine is managing quite well with the very few resources they have from this military overmight that Russia is. It's amazing that they haven't collapsed already. We should also look at the unconfirmed equipment losses. They are here, Russians' losses unconfirmed. They are about 35,000 pieces of equipment. And if you divide that number with 777, the number of days that this covers the entire war, then you get 46 daily equipment losses for Russia. That should actually be compared with how many new pieces of equipment can Russia produce currently. Well, they can only produce 5.3 pieces of equipment, so obviously it's not sustainable. Russia is drawing down their stocks that are quite substantial. They still got 37,000 pieces of equipment left in their stocks. So how many days would remain if we assume that Russia will keep losing 46 pieces of equipment every day? Well, if we multiply with 100, that would be 100 days. Then Russia will lose about 4,600 pieces of equipment. That is something they can easily do because they have 37,000. But what about 1,000 days? That's almost 3 years. Well, that would be 46,000 equipment losses. That's a number bigger than what they currently have actively or in stock. But of course, they'll also produce a little bit of new, but still, they can't sustain this for 3 years. Russia will run out of equipment from long-term storage in about 2 years from now, according to these numbers, if we assume that the intensity of the war will stay the same as it has on average for all of the war. Now, that's not a good assumption. The intensity of the war is most likely going to increase a lot, because I think now what is happening is that Ukraine is getting more aid from Europe and also United States. It very much look like today that the US Congress will approve those $60 billion of aid for Ukraine. That will help Ukraine quite a lot. And also I know Europe is increasing their military aid for Ukraine. So the intensity of the war is going to escalate a lot. And that means that Russia will have less than 2 years left of stocks. After that, what will happen is that then Russia will only be able to put into the war what they can produce every day of new equipment. And then the intensity of the war will actually drop off quite a lot. So the sooner we can get more weapons into Ukraine and get the intensity up of the Russian daily losses, the sooner Russia will run completely out of their long-term stocks. And then the war might actually end. Russia will see, okay, this is not possible. This is unsustainable. We can't win this war on Ukraine. And then they pull out. But that's wishful thinking. A lot of things can happen in the next 2 years, especially if we don't help Ukraine more. They can actually lose. But I think that's enough about these data here for total equipment losses. Okay, next we have personal losses. We can find them down here, killed personnel unconfirmed. I have data from the Ukraine Armed Services that are publishing how many Russians they believe they have killed every day. And it's quite a high number here. It's 451,000 people they have killed, believed killed, unconfirmed as of April 11th of 2024. And also they have an estimate of the wounded persons. That's normally 3 times higher. And that's also what the Ukrainian army there in their data assumes, that it's 3 times higher, because that's the experience from wars around the world, that it's normal that 3 times as many get wounded, either seriously or lightly, as the number of killed soldiers. And considering Russia, it's 1.3 million people who are wounded. Most of these people that are wounded will return to battle when they are fixed in a hospital and they're good to fight again. But of course, they're also seriously wounded that will never return to fight. That might be, I don't know, a guess would be maybe 400,000 that have lost legs and arms and eyes, and they'll never be back in fighting. So it's an enormous amount of people that are dying or are getting crippled. But Russia has a lot more people to take from. If you assume that 17% of the Russian population, women and men, could be fit for fight in a war, well, that would be almost 25 million people that they could expend, you could say, in a war effort. And Russia has historically lost that kind of numbers of people in the Second World War. I don't think it was quite 20 million, but it was definitely many millions. I'll have to look it up, but it's in the order of 10, 15 millions they lost during Second World War. So I think Putin, he would just lose these people and keep fighting. I don't think he's scared by 500,000 people lost. Not at all. It has to be many, many more millions before he cave in and withdraw from Ukraine. So what else can we see down here for personal losses? Well, I have a source that says that Russia is training about 30,000 new soldiers every month. So that amounts to about a production of almost 1,000 new soldiers that Russia is training every month. And that's actually a higher number than their daily losses on average, which is about 600. But they make almost 1,000. So the Russian army is getting stronger. It's growing its numbers. Of course, you also have to subtract the crippled people that are not coming back back to work. But I think it's growing slowly with the current recruitment and training efforts in Russia. Their army, it is getting stronger despite all of their losses. What else can we see? Ukraine doesn't tell how many killed they have, but I think we can estimate it. If we think that numbers of killed Russians is accurate, then we could simply take the Russian number of killed and then adjust it with the killing rate for equipment that Ukraine has. If we assume this is the same for people, which is not unreasonable, well, then we can use that to calculate how many Ukrainians that have been killed so far in the war. That would be almost 170,000 killed Ukrainians and almost 500,000 wounded, many of who will be crippled. So that's kind of the story about how many people that are dying in this war. So with these overall equipment losses and personal losses evident, and also the killing rates for these equipment and personal losses, who is actually winning the war? Can they tell us who is winning the war? Obviously, Russia is losing more than Ukraine, 2.7. But unfortunately, it's not enough for Ukraine to win the war. In fact, they're losing the war. And we can see that here. The fact is that Russia has a much bigger population than Ukraine. They have 145 million people, and Ukraine now only got 35 million people that they can draw soldiers from. So that means the population ratio between Russia and Ukraine is 4.1. So if it's about how many people we lose here, well, Ukraine, in order to win the war, eventually they'd have to kill more than 4.1 Russian for every Ukraine the Russians are killing, and they're not doing that. They're below at 2.7. I would say that for Putin to see, okay, this war is hopeless, we need to stop our losses, the killing rate that Ukraine needs to achieve needs to grow to about 6. If it grows to about 6 and stay there for a year or two, then Putin and the establishment in Moscow, they will realize, okay, this is not worth it, we'll pull out and end our losses, because otherwise our country will bleed up and we won't have any youth left to run the economy. So that's what it takes for Ukraine to win the war, that they get that killing rate up to 6, and that's entirely possible, and we'll come back to that later here in my presentation, to get that killing rate up. It can even go to 10, but it will require a lot more aid for Ukraine, more training of their soldiers, and better weapons, of course, and many more weapons. Also the economy. What is happening here? Well, Russia's economy is almost 14 times larger than Ukraine's. I'm not sure that is actually true, because Ukraine is not that poor a country actually. These GDP measures that I have got here, they're dependent on the currency translation from Ukrainian currency to US dollars, and also from Russian ruble to US dollars. And the Ukraine currency obviously is not worth a whole lot, so that will suppress the Ukrainian GDP. And Russia is in a much better position. They have oil revenue that they can use to keep the value of their ruble up. So that will also mean that their GDP in terms of dollars, as I've measured it here, that they're also higher. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Russian economy is many times larger than Ukraine's. It doesn't matter whether it's 14 times larger, or more realistically is perhaps 7 times larger because of some currency issues. But the point is that Russia can fight this war with their own resources, but Ukraine is absolutely incapable of fighting a war with Russia, only drawing from their own resources, from their own GDP, because that GDP is $161 billion. That's not enough for what Ukraine need. I can tell you that Russia is spending this year in 2024 upwards of $240 billion just on military expenses for this war. And Ukraine cannot spend their entire GDP on military expenses. They also have to feed their people and run the economy. But Ukraine are spending something like 33% of their GDP. That's the same as North Korea. It's the absolute maximum you can spend for military spending without people starting to starve to death and so forth, because there's no money for anything else. So my point is that Ukraine needs help from outside in order to win over Russia, but Russia doesn't. And Ukraine can easily get that help, because if you look at the United States, I have their GDP down here, it's $25,000 billion, and the European GDP is $20,000 billion. So we have plenty of money to support Ukraine with some $200 billion per year in military aid, and perhaps $50 billion more in financial aid to pay workers money in public administration and so forth, so the economy is running in Ukraine. We can easily do that. It's only a tiny part of our economy, and we will avoid having to go to war directly with Russia, because Ukraine will win the war over Russia if we give them $250 billion US dollars per year for financial aid and military aid, and also give them our modern weapon systems that are better than what Russia has. So yes, it can totally be done that Ukraine can win the war, but currently they are not able to win the war without outside help. And also the killing rate that we currently see for equipment and personnel, it's just not high enough for Russia to see that they're losing. In fact, they're winning long term with this kind of killing rates. But now let's move on to analyze how these killing rates are developing over time, because there's also some interesting things to be said about that. Okay, so the next slide here will show you how the kill ratios and also the daily losses have developed over time. In these two columns, I have the Russian average losses unconfirmed per day, and in the next column here, I have kill ratios, and that's for the period of the entire war, just like we had in in the previous table. But in this table here, I have the same numbers, but only from the last 10 months of the war. That includes the summer. It's June 15, where Ukraine launched a summer offensive, and that of course has affected the numbers. But what are the numbers? Let's establish that first. Well, we can see that it has not gone the right way for Ukraine. Overall, the kill ratio is 2.7, and now it's 2.6, so it has gone down in the past 10 months for Ukraine. It's not going in the right direction. We can also see that the intensity of the war has escalated from 46 daily equipment losses for Russia to 62 equipment losses for Russia. And because the kill rate is what it is, we can also assume that Ukraine is losing considerably more material and people in the past 10 months when compared to the average of the entire war. So what are the reasons that the kill ratio is dropping and the intensity of the war is going up? Well, one of the most important things I'd say is that Russia is mobilizing far more resources, increasing military spending from 3.7% of GDP in 2021, that was before the war started, then it increased to 7.1% in 2023, and it's likely going to be almost 11% of GDP here in this year, 2024. So Russia is throwing considerably more resources into this war than they did before the war and also in the beginning of the war. And that, of course, will increase the intensity of the war and also make it more likely that Russia can actually kill more Ukrainians, because the more you attack the enemy with, the better your kill ratios from your perspective will become. That's part of the logic of how war works. Also, Russia has adapted and started using a lot of these first-person viewer drones, the small drones. Ukraine, they're producing now 1 million of them per year. That's 3,000 per day. And I think Russia has also managed to get something similar into production that they're throwing at Ukraine. That has increased the losses on both sides enormously. And quite frankly, it's something we have never seen in a war before, that these small drones that are carrying a fragmentation bomb for killing infantry or an armor-piercing grenade for destroying tanks and armored fighting vehicles. We've never seen that used in any war before on that scale, and it's going to be even bigger. It's completely changing the war. These drones of all sizes, especially the smaller ones, are replacing to a large extent traditional weapons like artillery and mortars on the battlefield. And weapons that used to be very good, like tanks, they're no longer so great because they're so easily destroyed with these FPV drones that cost very little. So that's changing the war. And in the beginning of the war, I can say that Russia didn't have any FPV drones, but Ukraine in the beginning of the war quickly started to use what they could use and what they had the resources to use, and that was these FPV drones, and they had a lot of success with that. They still have a lot of success, and they also managed to ramp up production like many times, 100 times compared to what it was in the first few months of the war. And they will ramp it up further from those 1 million drones per year. It could in principle go to 10 million drones per year. That will completely change how this war will look if they can manage to do that. But Russia has adapted. They are also producing now, using these drones, a lot more of them, and that means they're killing many more Ukrainians. But Russia has also had a lot of success very recently, I'd say the past 6 months, by mass producing glider bombs, which are bombs that are dropped like 50 kilometers behind the front lines by fast flying airplanes that simply drop these bombs, and then they have wings and they have guidance equipment so they can steer themselves to a position on the front line that they want to blow up. And these bombs can be up to 2 tons heavy, filled with explosives. So they are enormous bombs compared to anything else that is on the battlefield. And Russia is seriously killing Ukrainians using this tactic. That's a real problem. Ukraine will have no match for it unless they get a lot more long-range anti-aircraft missile systems from the West. That's the only way to push the Russian aircraft further behind the front line so they can't drop these glider bombs. They simply have to get these long-range missile systems or Ukraine will lose the war. But I think Ukraine will eventually get those systems so they can keep the Russian airplanes away, or alternatively Ukraine will get their own airplanes to fight back these Russian airplanes and that way stop it from killing more Ukrainians. And then of course Ukraine does not get the ammunition and aid they need to defend themselves effectively. That's obvious. The US haven't been aiding Ukraine at any significant level for like 8 months straight, and Europe has not done enough. We have stepped our aid up quite a lot, but we haven't done enough. It's just not enough for Ukraine to prevail. So Ukraine's economy is getting destroyed by Russian long-range missiles and drones, and they are losing troops on the front lines, unfortunately, due to these glider bombs and also Russians' use of FPV drones. But it can be changed. We can definitely, as I said, we have this economy here of the United States and EU is much larger than Russia's, and all it takes for Ukraine to get the needed weapons they need to beat the Russians is like $250 billion per year, which is something we can easily spend without even noticing that we are spending it. It's tiny money compared to our economies. The luck of this war can easily change to the favor of Ukraine, and hopefully it will. But let's move on and discuss what actually affects these killing rates, because as I said, wars are won by having higher killing rates. So what are the determinants of kill ratios? Well, the first determinant I'm going to talk about is equipment quality and quantity. Obviously, basically the better the quality of your weapons, the higher the kill rate will be, and quantity also matters. They say that quantity is a quality in itself, and the more you have of quantity, the higher your kill ratios will also be. Ideally, we should just send the best weapons we have. So we should send Leopard 2 tanks instead of the older Leopard 1 tanks, and we should send F-35 fighter jets instead of F-16 fighter jets. Unfortunately, that's not really what Europe is doing. We are sending all the old crap that we have to Ukraine, making it much harder for Ukraine to actually win the war and get the killing rates up. We need to start to send more of the good stuff to Ukraine, like Patriot missile systems and our newest fighter jets, and also missiles, lots of missiles and drones that are the newest that we have. But currently there's not a political will in the US or Europe to do that, and hopefully that will change. The other determinant of kill ratios is ammunition quality and quantity. It is of course not enough to just have the weapons, you also need to have ammunition for the weapons. It seems like both United States and Europe has been completely surprised by this war, or it doesn't seem to. We have been completely surprised by this war that Russia has launched, and we have basically found ourselves in a situation where we don't have the production capability to produce enough ammunition for a war that lasts longer. We only have enough ammunition to fight a brief war somewhere in the third world where something needs to be fixed in a hurry, and that's all we have capacity for. We are not scaled to fight wars that are running for years, so we are scrambling really to get ammunition production up. We do have quality weapons here in the West, but we don't have the quantity for mass producing them. That has been a problem. Europe would actually like to give Ukraine more ammunition, but we just don't have the production capacity. But we are ramping up, and there will be more ammunition for Ukraine in the coming years. But I just hope it's enough that we actually understand, and I have my doubts that Europe still do not understand how serious this war is and how much more effort we should put into it in order to stop the Russians. Okay, so what's the third reason? That's personal quality and quantity. Now, I'm of the opinion that NATO should use all of its training resources to train as many Ukrainians as possible. We know that Russia is recruiting and making about 30,000 soldiers every month, and Ukraine's population right now is 35 million. So if we assume 17% of their population can be fit for military service, that would be 6 million men and women that could go to war. Now that would compare to 100,000 Ukrainians that could be trained for combat every month. And I think if NATO used all of its resources, we could actually train that many soldiers and then outbeat how many soldiers that Russia is training, so that Ukraine can get many more soldiers on the battlefield than Russia can with their economy, because Russia can't just have them trained in another country. They have to train them themselves, and NATO has many more training resources for Ukraine. So that would be another way for NATO to have Ukraine win this war. We simply start training a lot more soldiers. That's another way to get the killing ratio up. And the final thing is probably the most important thing ever, but it's not talked much about because it's very, very controversial. It's a willingness to fight and kill the enemy, doing whatever it takes to be effective without any restrictions. It's just a fact of all that the more violent and cynical and gruesome you are towards your enemy, the more effective you are on the battlefield. It's a fact. If you throw flowers at your enemy, you're not killing them, and you won't win the war with that. You have to actually kill them. And sometimes it's more effective if you also kill a lot of innocent bystanders. But we don't allow ourselves to do that here in the West, and we're also putting restrictions on Ukraine not to really not care about civilians, but just care about winning the battle, killing as many Russian soldiers as possible. I'll give you some examples of why being maximum violent is also getting the killing rates up, and you get more effective in that way. ISIS, this Islamic terrorist organization, you could call them, they're very effective because they're so gruesome and careless about civilians and human lives, but that also makes them feared enormously for the people that they're fighting, especially the civilian population. They know that they'll be slaughtered in the worst possible ways if they don't supply food and equipment to the ISIS army. It actually took the combined effort of Europe, United States, Iraq themselves. Iran was also helping, Russia was helping, and Syria was fighting them. It took us like 2 years to get rid of this ISIS army in Iraq and also in Syria, and they had far, far less resources than we had. How could that even be possible? It was because they simply are so feared among the civilians in the areas that they operate in that they can get all the supplies they need simply by being brutal. I can tell you, I don't want to pick on Muslims. So my own forefathers, they were Vikings. We were also technologically not really as advanced as the British people that we were attacking in England, and we were not as numerous either, but we were extremely violent, and we also had this death cult belief that also resembles an Islamist organization, that they think they go to paradise. For them, it's a paradise with a lot of virgins and all the sex they can imagine. For the Vikings, it was the glory of honorable death and sitting in a table full of delicious food in Valhalla, which was big house for the gods, and having dinner with the gods. So they were not afraid of dying. That's the point I have. They had a religion that made them completely fearless in battle. And if there's something that kills effectiveness on the battlefield, it's fear among the soldiers, so they don't dare to do anything on the battlefield. But if you have a religion like ISIS or my Viking forefathers that made them completely fearless of dying, they wanted to die, then you can have very high kill ratios. And also if you apply a lot of violence that made your enemies poo their pants literally and run away out of fear of being taken captured and being tortured by these savages. So extreme violence does make a difference. It does increase killing rates. And I think we have been living in a time where United States has been such a superior power with such more modern weapons than everybody else, both in quantity and quality. The United States, they could actually behave humanely when they were conducting war, far more humanely than any other war we have seen. They could do that because they were so superior. But now we are in a world where United States is no longer that superior, and Europe is not any superior either to the rest of the world. We are far more on an equal playing field, especially with these drone weapons that are coming up that are cheap and that can be mass produced. That means that this factor here, willingness to fight and kill the enemy, is getting more important. And that just means that the wars we're going to have going forward, and also this war in Ukraine, is going to be more ugly and more like the Middle Age slaughtering that we have seen in our history. That's my take on it. I have no illusions that this can be done in a nice manner at all. I'd say one thing where we have told Ukraine not to attack Russia, that's just Russia is destroying the Ukrainian economy with long-range drones, and of course, for Ukraine to win this war, they will have to make even more destruction in Russia using long-range drones that they could perhaps produce in larger numbers than Russia. That's how you win the war. You destroy Russia's ability to feed their army, you destroy their economy, you destroy their army and their effectiveness. So that's definitely one of the things where I think that the West simply have to stop being delusional about what it takes to win a war and say to Ukraine, yes, of course you can destroy Russia using tens or hundreds of thousands of long-range drones blowing up factories and stuff in Russia. So I don't know if you feel good or bad about this video, but I'll try to be honest about what I think is the determinants of war and about how it's going in this war, who's winning. Ukraine is currently losing, unfortunately, because they don't get the aid that they need. But on the optimistic side, the West can definitely change its opinion, and we have the resources and we can supply Ukraine with all the equipment they need to win. And we can also relax our own demands on Ukraine on what they can attack and not attack, so they can be more effective destroying the Russian economy and thereby the Russian ability to keep fighting in Ukraine. I have a lot more to talk about with kill ratios, for the specific kill ratios for airplanes, artillery and tanks and so forth, because there's a lot of details you can talk about that give you a much better picture of what's up and down in this war. And I'm going to make forthcoming videos about that. So if you're interested in seeing these videos and hearing my opinion about what's going on and how Ukraine can improve their killing ratios in specific areas of equipment, well, then you should subscribe to my channel, and then these videos are coming forward. They should come out in a few weeks. But with that, I think I'll end my video and just wish you a great life in freedom and democracy. Goodbye.